Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Kim from the Mable team, and today's webinar is hosted by Libby Ellis, who leads Mable's Home and Living Consultants. The webinar is called Starting Your NDIS Home and Living Journey Confidently, and it's a session designed for people who are just starting to think about moving out or living more independently. What we really hope this webinar will do is help you feel clear and confident about next steps as you start your journey. And today we'll be guiding you through the first stages. What we'll talk about is imagining what the right home looks like, understanding what supports are available, and how you can prepare for future NDIS conversations. And we'll also discuss what evidence means in the NDIS world. So just on the next slide, Libby, I'd just like to acknowledge country. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So Libby and I both work for Mable, and obviously know that many of you here would have used Mable before or heard of it. But for those who have yet to engage with Mable before and are curious about what we do, so we're an online platform, a website, and an app where people who are looking for support can connect with independent support workers in their local area. And a subshoot of Mable is the Mable Home and Living Consultants, which Libby leads. Just on the next slide, Libby. So today's presentation is meant to be a starter, but obviously the home and living journey is very complex and very personal. So if you have any questions, we do have a chat function for this webinar. Please pop them in, but if you would like to discuss your personal situation a little bit more, please do drop us an email at homeandliving@mable.com.au, and Libby will be more than happy to have a chat. We will try to spend some time at the end of this webinar talking through some common questions that have come through. And also just wanted to let you all know that this webinar is recorded. You will all receive a copy of it tomorrow in your inboxes. So that's my very long intro. I'll now hand over to Libby. Hi, Libby.
Hi, Kim. Thanks so much. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm coming to you from Nipaluna, Hobart. And before we launch into the main content for today, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. So yes, I lead Mable Home and Living Consultants, and I've been working in the area of individualised living for quite a long time. And I also have a brother, Matthew, who's an NDIS participant, and Matt is 54 years old, and he has a significant intellectual disability. He's autistic and he doesn't speak, although we always think of him as communicating. And we helped Matthew move from institutional and group home living a number of years ago. And he's lived for quite some time now with non-disabled people who are his supportive housemates. And here you can see a great photo of him in the middle with his two supportive housemates, with permission to share this image of them. And Matthew's had different housemates over the years, and they provide him with companionship, overnight safety, and help with maintenance of his home and garden. And he also has a paid support team. So what prompted us to make this change in his living situation? And as I'm talking, maybe you can think about what might be prompting you or why you've come along today to the webinar. So we made this change because Matt really wasn't getting the care and support that he needed. In fact, he'd really suffered some quite serious incidents where he had been living, and he unfortunately had developed behaviours which were putting him more at risk. So we met because we were thinking this wasn't right. And along that way, we met with other families and other people with disability who said, things could be different or could be better. We really didn't have any funding or resources for a house at that stage. This was definitely before the NDIS. This was before the NDIS. So I guess I'm sharing that story, a bit of Matthew's background with you, just to, as I said, help you think about what might be prompting you to get started in this area. Maybe it's something like having an aging parent. Maybe you thought you had a place to live that was ongoing and then something's changed, like somebody we worked with recently who was living with her sister and thought that that was an ongoing, that was something that could just be ongoing. But her sister then said that that was no longer possible after a certain date and she needed to find a new place to live. Maybe you're noticing that your home and support needs aren't quite in sync so much anymore. Perhaps you can't get around as easily in your home anymore, or the supports you need to live there aren't quite right. Or maybe, like us, you're thinking that life should look different and you're wondering how to do that. So if you have a sense that things are changing or need to change, that is a really good time to get started, so that you can plan and that you can be in control of that change as much as possible. As timing with the NDIS is a whole topic in itself. Really encouraging you in this webinar, to get started. If you're thinking about it, now is a great time to get started. So the three important steps that we really want you to take away from today as you get started are, firstly, having a really strong sense of your own version of home. What does your own personal model look like for you? What would work for you in your home and living supports? And you've heard me describe Matthew's a little bit, and we're going to see some other examples in a moment. And then what support do you need to make that successful, that version of your own version of home? What support would you need to make that successful and not leaving you vulnerable or unsafe or perhaps lonely? The second step is understanding what NDIS home and living funding would best match your vision. And thirdly is that the NDIA will need evidence to show eligibility or show need for those different kinds of NDIS home and living supports. So it certainly is the case that home and living is one of the areas in the NDIS, unfortunately, that we're least able to guarantee consistent decisions from the NDIA. But at the same time, we know that these three things, these three steps, are the strongest approach. Even though we can't say, and I'm sure you might be already very experienced in this with the NDIS, is that we can't say you can do step 1, step 2, and step 3, and you will absolutely guarantee that you can get, X funding in your plan. Only the NDIA makes those reasonable and necessary decisions. But we do know that these three things are the strongest approach, the right approach to take. So just want to affirm here this combination of having a strong sense of your own vision and then the evidence to request and show eligibility for an NDIS support that best matches your vision. And another really key message here, we think, is thinking about starting with vision rather than starting with funding. So funding is certainly an enabler. So it's going to be really important to understand the guidelines and what the eligibility is for those home and living supports. But when you go looking, when you start there at those 3-letter acronyms, there's lots of them. There's SIL, there's ILO, there's SDA. You're not really going to find a descriptor of the possibilities or the model that's right for you in those guidelines and in those funding descriptions. So we really need to start with what would work, what would be right for you, what is your version of home and living. And to do that, we're going to just take some time to look at some examples. And this is one of the first key steps in getting started, is really thinking about looking at what other people have done and thinking about what would and wouldn't work for you. So as we look at these videos, you can have a think about the things that you like and that you don't like, the things that you're curious about, the things that would or wouldn't work for you.
Hi, I'm Carissa, Blake's sister. Blake lives independently now with 24/7 support, but we have had this vision for a long time and we weren't really sure that we'd be able to get here, and here we are, which is exciting. We started thinking about independent living for Blake around about 9 or 10 years ago. We had a circle of support that met to talk about Blake's future, and my sister and I went to a workshop with crew that Libby Ellis from Mable was presenting, and she spoke about her experiences with her brother Matthew. And it was really encouraging to see someone with similar abilities to Blake living in his own home. From there, we realised that that was actually possible for Blake to do as well.
Hi, I'm Kathy. I'm Blake's house manager. I've been tasked with supporting the support workers in helping Blake and making sure that they have everything they need day to day so that Blake lives his best life, lives how he wants to be living in his home.
So the setup here in this house is that Blake lives upstairs, and underneath there is a separate space for someone to live in, and there's also a studio space for an individual or couple to live in, and these become the property mates.
Hello, my name is Zach, and I'm a support worker and housemate for Blake and Nori. I've definitely noticed a change with Blake. When I first started working, his parents was living with him, and after a year they transitioned away, and then Blake had full-time support. And absolutely, you can tangibly tell the difference between before and after, because Blake's really grown up in a lot of ways as well. As any person moves out of home, it's more responsibility that comes with that.
So there's a property mates dinner here. Blake is hosting it tonight. The lovely thing here is we do have a team. We've built a team around Blake, his circle of support, his family, and the people that are here on the property, as well as his support mates.
Blake moved into this house 4 years ago, it was the night before his birthday, so he got to wake up here on his birthday. Back then, Mum and Dad lived with him as well. Living independently has been great for Blake because he is able to be safe in his own space that's been created specifically for him. He's got support workers that can tailor his activities to his needs. And he's able to live an ordinary life away from living at home, so that it's just like what any other man in their 20s would do. Having a resource where there's case studies is exactly what did help us. Going to a workshop where Libby was presenting is what made it all possible.
Okay, so now you've seen a couple of examples now of people living with others. So maybe that's something that interests you, and you can start to think about what you've seen here and what you like and don't like, what would it need to look like for you. But let's see another couple of examples. So Sam lives in something called specialist disability accommodation, or SDA. And when you watch her video, you can think about a couple of things. Firstly, do you or your family member or the person that you support need any technology or features in your home that help you to live more independently? And you can also think about whether your family member or the person you support needs really highly accessible or specially designed housing.
Hi, I'm Sam and I live in specialist disability accommodation. So specialist disability accommodation is what SDA stands for, and they are properties designed with specific needs in mind. So my home, which is the fully accessible. These are specially designed for people that have some mobility issues. The properties all have 0 stairs, easy accessible kitchens, accessible bathrooms, big wide doorways. So my doorways all stand at about 1.2 metres wide. So that can fit most wheelchairs through.
Great. And then lastly, I think we've got some information to share there, Kim, just to explain those couple of options a little bit more. And then lastly, we've got a video of Cameron, who Cameron and his family and supporters who share how they got started on his journey to independent living.
Cameron is a 22-year-old young man who loves rowing and photography and bushwalking, and owns a small business, Zelma Services, scanning slides. We have a vision for Cameron's good life, and that's to live an independent life with meaningful roles. Part of that is living in his own. Most young people move out of home in their 20s. It's a natural thing to do. His brother also wanted to encourage him to move out of home, saying that he would be perfectly competent in a group house with friends. Having Aidan in the background supporting me was really reassuring, because I wasn't sure Cameron had the skills and capacity to move out of home. Erica and her family kindly offered to trial Cameron moving out of home and living in his own space. As any young mum with a vulnerable young person, I had unconscious fears that needed some reassurance.
See, as a young man in my 20s, having moved to Canberra for university, it was a great opportunity to really talk to Cameron and relate my own experience as to what he's going through in working towards moving out of home.
It took a little bit of time to communicate with everybody and make sure everybody was comfortable with the arrangement. What was really lovely is she handed the keys to him. It was made really clear to Cameron from the start that he was in charge. He would be opening and closing the front door. It took him a little while to get the hang of opening the front door, but within a couple of weeks he had that. I was actually really impressed.
One of the ways we really differentiated this opportunity from a holiday to a home for Cameron was by leaving things there that he needed in his daily and weekly schedule. So that included clothes and food and cooking ingredients and books and puzzles, so that he was able to live his normal life within this new opportunity. But it was also important to really reinstate the idea of doing the washing the dishes and cleaning the floors.
We can confidently say as a young man, Cameron would rather be doing other things than cleaning, but he's committed to moving out of home and he will do his share.
As Cameron is great with his routine, we actually realised that he didn't need as much support as what we were expecting.
Cameron has a smartwatch. We've entered everything. He's comfortable with a touch screen and there are pictures and he can just select who he wants to phone. Cameron is a very social young man but has limited language, and so we want him to be confident. The moment he uses the watch to say he's arrived somewhere or he's left somewhere is about safeguarding Cameron, and we know where he is, what he's doing and who he is with, and just keep him a little bit safe. Routine's really important to Cameron. Part of his routine in the morning at family home is to get up and open up the curtains. The curtains were very different, and he can be unintentionally rough if he's not concentrating because he's a large young man. I was also a little bit worried about the stove. He was used to an electric stove and it was a gas stove. I wanted to make sure all of the team members were consistently turning power points off and unplugging kitchen appliances. That's something Cameron's always done, and I did not want him to lose that skill in a new setting. I wanted him to generalise it. So it was about 2 months. He was there one night a week. On the final week, we actually knew it was finishing up and we went to 2 nights, and Cameron was left in his home on his own for a 2 to 3 hour period in the afternoon.
This opportunity for us really showed Cameron actually needed less support. In the evenings, we were merely there in case something happened, in case of emergency. And that was great for us because it showed us that all this work that we had done previously and really established within Cameron.
And I had expected the unexpected, and there was no unexpected. Reflecting back now, I don't really know why I was so concerned. It's amazing how well Cameron's adapted to spending time in the house without family. The growth that I've seen in Cameron from him spending time looking after Erica's house is just lovely. I've been greatly reassured that this is well within his capacity and he will actually step forward and grow as a result of moving out of home.
So I'm hoping that you're really getting some of your juices flowing by looking at these examples from today. And that last story, I think is really great in a couple of, well, lots of different areas, but a couple that always stand out for me is how can people learn about this by practicing, by looking after somebody else's home, for example, and how can families and parents really channel their worries and their concerns into developing what I call very practical safeguards. So you could hear Karen saying things like, I worried about this, I worried about that. And then you could also see what turning those worries into a solution or a response, a safeguard, looks like. So this is another great step in getting started. I call it listing out all of expressing your worries, listing out the what ifs. What if Cameron, what if Cameron did something with the stove? That's an example of a what if. What do we need to put in place before that? And what would we need to put in place if that thing did actually happen? So you can absolutely start to think about what your version of home is by looking at examples and by pulling out what you don't like and don't like about things. And if anybody wants to share any thoughts you've had already in the chat, that'd be so great to hear. Webinars are strange beasts, aren't they? So really great to hear any thoughts you're having so far. So answering these questions on this slide is also a great way to start. So you might not know everything, but pretty much everybody has some really solid information in a lot of these areas to get started with and to record. For example, you will know what works for you now in your life and supports, what's working well. You will also have knowledge, unfortunately, about things that absolutely don't work for you, things that mustn't happen or mustn't happen ever again. You will have information on systems or things that you've got in place right now because they help keep you safe. Lots of those will be really unconscious. And this is, I guess, about bringing these things more into your conscience. Like, why do you do things that way? And probably an answer there is because they help keep you safe and well. You might have information about gaps and problems, again, unfortunately, which are making you unsafe or feeling, as we said at the beginning, like things aren't kind of quite syncing up now and something needs to be different. Another thing is really important, we'll come back to this in a moment, is a rundown of everything a parent does in the background as a matter of habit that makes life tick over. So what do you want your home to be like? And I've got a little example here of John. When we worked through this question with John, we discovered that John really needs space in his home. He needs to move through the house and he really likes to find particular sensory objects in different rooms. And when he does that, when he has the ability to kind of move through from room to room, spend time in that room with sensory objects that really he really engages with, as long as there are not things in that room that make him unsafe. There are some things that he will make a beeline for that aren't good, but there are also lots of things that he will make a beeline for that are great for him. And when that happens for him, he's quite content and safe. So that when you think about that, that could mean that he could actually have another person in the house, somewhere else in the house, but not necessarily need to have them right beside him. And this is quite different for John for when he's out and about. When John is out and about, he needs two people to be with him all of the time. But when we start to unpack some of these questions, we can think, okay, actually, for some of the time in John's home, yes, he might need somebody else to be in that home, but he doesn't need that person to be with him right next to him like he does out in the community. They could be perhaps downstairs or in another part of the house. And as long as John, you know, for an hour, he's got time to move through and be engaged with his objects, he's okay. So this is the kind of information that you can start to pull out when you're thinking about your version of home. So let's have a look at this in practice with a man called Angus. So this is Angus's the start of a statement about Angus's ideal home and support arrangement. And Angus is a 25-year-old autistic man, and his dad and his brother and sister are thinking about his future, as he won't be able to continue living with his mum long term. So when we go back to the beginning of the webinar, that's the thing that's kind of triggering them to start thinking about this. They know that living with mum isn't going to be a long-term option, and they want to get started with planning for what should happen for Angus now. So they're starting from deep love for Angus, but really a very low base of knowledge and involvement with his NDIS supports. So in answering these questions together, the kinds of questions that were on the previous slide, and then understanding what other trusted professionals in his life think, we came up with a starting vision, a starting version of home and support for Angus. So everybody who loves and cares about Angus believes that he needs a living situation that's tailored to his needs and preferences, rather than placing him in a pre-existing setup without consideration for his specific requirements. It's also very important that even though Angus struggles with social engagement, in fact, it's probably one of his main struggles in life, that he's actually connected with others so that he's not lonely. So there was a really strong common view that one of the biggest vulnerabilities for Angus is the risk of social isolation. Living with others who act unpredictably, who have their own needs that aren't easily explained or understood, would be very difficult for Angus. So he really needs people. His risk is social isolation, so it's important that he lives with others, but what kind of people are those other people is also really important. So he needs people who can co-regulate, can problem solve, can be structured in their approach to him and really help him develop his skills. So for all of those reasons, it's envisaged that Angus would be living in close proximity to his sister, in a home that initially would be a rental with a longer term goal of purchasing a home for him. Angus would live with a supportive housemate or housemates who offer companionship and informal assistance, and that structure that we were just talking about. He would also be supported by a structured team of paid support workers who understand his needs and can provide him with that consistency in his daily life. He'd also have a trained assistance dog who plays an important role in his emotional well-being and confidence when getting out and about in his community. And then surrounding that kind of direct support model would be a circle of support, or potentially something called a microboard, which is a bit more of a formal structure than a circle of support, made up of trusted individuals who come together to help guide decisions, safeguard his future, and ensure his supports are working well. And then any or all of these elements in this support system may be supported by a service provider or providers, organisations willing and competent to support this vision. And if this is the first time that you're hearing about things called a circle of support or a microboard, Kim's shared a link for you to find out some more information about them. So who can help you with this first step of your vision or your version of home? Well, as you've heard, we certainly help people answer these questions, but others who could be involved are somebody like a trusted parent or family member, or even a trusted worker who's been involved with you might be able to help you document your answers to some of those questions that we just talked through. A trusted person, a trusted worker might have insights into what they think could work and environments and situations that suit you. But I really want to highlight that these need to be trusted and known people in your life. And an example of that actually is Andrea, who'd moved away from home from her parents, but it hadn't quite worked so well. So she moved back home with her parents, and then there was this sort of review period. And during that review period, she worked with a trusted support worker to reflect, to go back out and start looking at places, to listen to that worker's ideas, to brainstorm things together, to use images and stories, and to think about what would work better next time. And they came up with a great list together. Things like wanted it to be located in the city. Andrea absolutely needed to have minimal barriers to entry to her home. This was a bit different to the last place. There were lots of things that they were able to work on together as like a project together that helped Andrea really think about what would be better next time. If you have funding for support coordination in your NDIS plan, a support coordinator might be able to help you with these things depending on your budget and other priorities that you're working on with them. Allied health professionals, such as an occupational therapist, are definitely needed for evidence, but they can also be exploring the implications and helping you figure out your version of home and the pathways that might be right for you as well. And I got another example of that with Dev, who has nocturnal seizures, and previously he'd had a supportive housemate model as well, and his seizures were really quite manageable. But that's changed and they've increased, and Dev's mother's actually sleeping in the same room with him and waking at stage times through the night with him. So in thinking about, he really wants to think about that supportive housemate model again, but we really need to have some expertise to think about what the implications of his overnight supports are now. Lastly, I've listed out a group of organisations called the National Alliance of Capacity Building Organisations. They're a group of organisations, there's one in pretty much every state, who have funding outside of the NDIS to help people think about home. And again, Kim is going to share a link to those organisations. And we're also going to share a link to another really fantastic website that's got lots of great stories and different examples of people living in different ways. So now let's have a look. So we're on to the second step now, which is NDIS home and different kinds of NDIS home and living supports. And we're going to do an overview of those supports only. Really, that they could be a whole webinar in themselves, which we'd be happy to offer you. We can also link you to some other information and webinars that explain all the different home and living supports in more detail. First, let's have a look at what are the housing or bricks and mortar, the housing options that are available for NDIS participants. So we've got this, can you see that? Yeah, there we go. So the first one that we've heard today is specialist disability accommodation. And you saw Sam living in her SDA. The next option available to people is something called non-SDA supported accommodation. And this is where housing and support are provided together. And this is also sometimes referred to now as a SIL house or SIL accommodation. The next option, housing option for NDIS participants, is social housing, and social housing is subsidised, government subsidised short and long-term rental housing, and it can be owned and managed by state governments, so that's called public housing, or it could be managed by a non-profit organisation, and that's called community housing. Other options available for people are private rentals. So these are really just the housing options that are available for all Australians. Your own home, somebody else's home. We're going to come back to that in a moment. So yes, people, NDIS participants might live in the home of somebody else. And lastly, in your family home. So you can see here that the NDIS only pays for a small proportion of people's housing, and that is SDA. SDA is the only housing payment that the NDIS makes. But what else is there in terms of NDIS home and living supports? Well, there's the help that people need to live in that housing. And this is three main areas. And here we start to see more of the three-letter acronyms. So there's SIL, or Supported Independent Living, ILO, or Individualised Living Options, CORE, or Assistance with Daily Living. And all of these have some criteria around them. And we're going to jump into that in a moment. So you can live in any kind of housing that we've just done in the circle with an in-home support component. So for example, a person with SIL funding could be living in specialist disability accommodation, or they could be living in a private rental. There are some other things, other important things that could be in people's plans to help them with their home and living needs. So for example, assistive technology or capacity building supports. Let's have a look at some of these in more detail. So what is, let's have a think about SDA in a bit more detail. So as we've mentioned, SDA is about the house. As I've said, it's the only payment the NDIS makes for bricks and mortar. And SDA recognises that the impact of many people's disabilities means that they're going to need specially designed features in their home, highly accessible housing in order to live more independently. And that kind of housing really you just can't find in the ordinary market. So the NDIS is kind of creating a way for that highly accessible or highly specialised housing to be built. And there are really specific criteria, eligibility criteria that you need to meet to be eligible for SDA. So you need to be a person with an extreme, what's called an extreme functional impairment, or very high support needs. And there are really specific definitions of what those two things mean as well. So, for example, an extreme functional impairment means that you have extremely reduced function in mobility, or the ors are important in one of these things really, or in self-care, or in self-management. And self-management here doesn't mean like the way that you manage your NDIS funding. Self-management is about a person's ability to problem solve, to make decisions. So as we said at the beginning with Sam's video, you can have a think about, maybe one of the reasons why there might be a sort of a mismatch going on between your home and support is because perhaps things are happening to you that might indicate that you need more specially designed features in your home. What's SIL, or supported independent living? So SIL is assistance from paid support workers at home for people who need really high levels of support from another person, or they need to be able to access that person all of the time. So that's different to kind of having a roster of drop-in support. This is saying a person needs to have access to somebody on site all of the time. And this is typically defined as needing more than 8 hours of self-care and household support across a 24-hour period. So that means the person also needs to have some kind of overnight support, whether that's active support or inactive support. Some disability housing is also referred to as SIL housing. So this is where a support organisation owns or rents a property and subleases it to people with disability, or enables people with disability to bring their SIL funding and live in that home. So it's really important to check what your relationship would be when you're starting to think about, you're engaged with SIL providers, what your relationship would be to the housing bit. So for example, are you going to be a tenant in that property and have the rights and responsibilities of a tenant? So it is common that providers bring them together. So it looks like housing is paid for by the NDIS, but you can see here that the SIL funding is just about the support that people need in their home, but providers offer that together with the housing. Lastly, what is individualised living options, or ILO? So ILO, similarly to SIL, is funding to support you in your home, but it's through different kinds of relationships than those sort of 24/7 rostered supports that we saw in SIL. So ILO supports people to think, plan for and fund other kinds of supportive relationships, and you've seen some of those kinds of relationships in the videos already. So an example of that is housemates. So where you might invite someone to share your home and provide an agreed amount of support, help or companionship. Sometimes people live in somebody else's home, so they live in a family or a couple who already have a home and agree to share it with a person with a disability, and this is called a host arrangement. They pay the host an agreed amount to cover rent, board or lodgings from their personal money, and then the host might provide disability-related support or household assistance and a family environment for an agreed level of reimbursement or payment, which is funded through the ILO funding. Sometimes people don't do this full-time. They don't live in somebody else's home full-time, but they might go and stay in somebody else's home part-time every one weekend a month, for example. And that helps to give everybody some time away and help make their arrangement sustainable. Sometimes people might have neighbours involved as well. They could also have a paid team of supporters. So you can see here in ILO, there may be a mix of different kinds of support. And because of that, the ILO is funded in two different stages. There's a first stage which gives people a bunch of hours to really explore what would work for them. It's called Explore and Design, and it can be up to 100 hours. Once that's done, there's a second stage that then can be triggered. So there's Explore and Design. Once you've come up with a model, and you've heard some of the starting frameworks, for example, through Angus or through Matthew, you could think about, well, what would that cost? And that is called an ILO service proposal that gets developed. So you design it, and then you basically put it down on paper and quote it or fund it, and then you submit that to the NDIA to trigger the second stage, which is the funding that you then need to implement or to live in that kind of arrangement. So now we've kind of connected this, like what is your version of home? What would work for you? Starting to think about what are some of the NDIS funding options that might fit. So the third step that we wanted to cover today is evidence. So here I'm giving you some really basically some starting information about what evidence means in the NDIS. Evidence is really important. Maybe if you're like us, you learned that the hard way. So remember that each home and living option has its own eligibility that you need to meet. And each of those, so we started to talk about those eligibility criteria in the last slides, and each of those also includes the reasonable and necessary criteria. So you saw like a specific rundown of SIL, and embedded in that also is that it needs to be determined that SIL would be a reasonable and necessary, would meet the reasonable and necessary criteria for you. So there's kind of two things, reasonable and necessary, and then the specific things that we went through in each of those funding options that need to be evidenced and need the criteria that you need to meet. So today it's really just helping you get in the mindset of evidence. And why is that? Well, it's because the scheme is evidence-based, and it's how the NDIA makes decisions. So it is how it assesses eligibility for things like supported independent living, and how it understands the specific impacts of your disability on your daily life. And the NDIA won't accept requests for support without evidence. So the first thing is that you're going to need a housing goal in your plan. And you can update your goals at any time. And the housing goal relates to reasonable and necessary criteria, and it's the first indicator, it's the first trigger to the NDIA that you want something different to happen here. So what else? So evidence gives a rundown of your daily support and housing needs. It should specify how often and when you need that support each day, really important. What kind of support? So almost like an hour by hour, sometimes people might even need a 30-minute by 30-minute breakdown of the kind of supports that they need at any given point of the day. Evidence outlines your functional capacity and the impact on your daily life and housing needs. And functional capacity means the things you can and can't do because of your disability. And an occupational therapist is someone who's trained to evaluate a person's ability to perform the activities of daily living. Other things that are included in evidence are what other home and living options you've explored and why they don't meet your disability-related support needs. Evidence should be current, and it should show what has changed in your support needs and what you can and can't do now. And I'll just give a quick example of Jonathan, who is thinking about this idea of exploring what other home and living options have you explored. So Jonathan was living in social housing and he applied for specialist disability accommodation. And the NDIA said that he wasn't eligible for specialist disability accommodation. And one of the reasons we think that is because in his evidence, he didn't give enough information about whether he could get that kind of housing through his social housing provider. So if Jonathan could get his home and living needs met through something other than SDA, that's what the NDIA would look to first. So he really needed to show evidence from the social housing provider that they didn't have any properties that would meet his disability specific needs. And kind of things like having a waiting list, being on a waiting list, aren't disability related support needs. So there was really no clear evidence from the social housing provider that his current home, they couldn't modify his current home to suit his needs, and that they didn't have any other suitable properties. We've got a couple of great articles actually that help you. I might skip to that to share with you that thinking about this issue of evidence. We've got some articles in our topic library that really help you think through how you might describe both your home and living support needs and how you might get support from allied health professionals, particularly in OT, to bring that evidence together. So let's think about steps and timings with coming back to Angus again. So if you're starting out and you're going to need to trigger the NDIA to consider something new. And as we've discussed, this means having a housing goal and having evidence for new and increased supports. So definitely reach out to us because we can help you think about exactly where you're at in your NDIS plan cycle and what you might need to do next. Because it is, Kim and I talked a lot about this because it is quite different for each person. But let's think about Angus. So we know he's got an initial idea about what the future should be, but looking at his plan, it's really still one which relies really heavily on his mum. So the funding basically mirrors the fact that his mum, for example, is the person who's there overnight with him. Another important thing to know about Angus is that he does, while he sleeps through the night, so he doesn't need any active support overnight, he wouldn't know what to do if there was an emergency. So he does need some kind of support overnight. And in fact, despite lots of training, he finds it really difficult to generalize skills. So we can train him to be, to be able to call somebody on the telephone, but actually what was discovered is that anytime something actually happens, he's not able to problem solve in the moment and he's more likely to freeze. So he's in the first kind of quarter of his current plan. So he's not coming up for a plan reassessment or review. And because of that initial vision work and analysing the assessments that he'd already had done, we're thinking about ILO as the pathway. So he's going to need to do three things. Firstly, show that he requires 6 or more hours of support each day. So he needs to develop those assessments and evidence. He's going to need to complete a change of situation form because he's signaling something different. He's in his plan cycle, but he's now signaling that something quite different needs to happen for him and he's not kind of coming up for a normal plan review. And he's also going to need to put all of that together with something called a home and living supporting evidence form. And the supporting evidence form looks pretty straightforward, but we do recommend that you seek some assistance and advice before submitting it, because there's a lot in there that the NDIS uses to make its decisions. Have I just lost the
I think if you just head back into presenter mode, Libby will be good.
Okay. That was strange.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. So for example, we need that. He needs that supporting evidence form to really highlight to the NDIA that he's signalling the ILO pathway. So we've got a couple of articles that provide some really great hints on filling out that supporting evidence form. So we've got his personal preferences and documents. We've got the evidence to show eligibility for that 6 or more hours of support, a change of situation, and the home and living supporting evidence form that's going to trigger the NDIS process for Angus. And I've linked those two things in the middle because we spent quite a bit of time talking about them today, and really they feed in and inform each other. So you heard earlier that example with Dev and his nocturnal seizure management. He wants to have a supportive housemate model, but we really need to work with his team to think about what does his overnight support look like now. So really this whole process could take the length of the plan for Angus actually. And if you track back from that, so for example, if the person doesn't have funding to do those assessments, that's what needs to be attended to first. So again, highlighting, I guess that now is a great time to get started, because things do take time. So just winding up again, we can help you. We can absolutely help you to work out where you're at and what's needed next. And you're very welcome to contact us by email. We also have an inquiry form on the website, and we are very happy to have a call with you to discuss your situation and what might be worth doing next. And we will absolutely send out all of these links to you in an email afterwards. So we've got a couple of minutes. Kim, were there any key themes or questions that came up?
Yes, there is a couple of questions. So one is a question about timing. So I think people are quite keen to understand how far in advance of plan review do you need to flag a change of situation?
Yeah, so if you wanted to wait, it's perfectly fine to wait for your plan review to have that conversation, but you will need to bring some of that evidence together. So for example, if you wanted to go into your, say, thinking about somebody whose plan review that we're working with is coming up in November, their natural plan review. So the NDIA could be contacting them anytime from August in that 3 month to lock in that date for that plan reassessment. So really working back now, now is the time to be working on bringing, because they don't have an OT in place, for example. So now's the time to be working on some of that. What are we trying to aim here for? Bringing an OT on board to start doing some of those assessments.
And then I think lastly, Libby, just a question about the consultancy and if there are any fees involved.
Yes, there are fees involved, but the process is, firstly, we'd be great to have a conversation with you, and there's absolutely no charge for a conversation, and sometimes we have more than one conversation with people. once we've sort of figured out how could the consultancy help you, what sort of things can we do that really help you progress your goals, then we put a quote together. So the quote outlines the things that we would do, and what it costs and how many hours it might take. And then you can reflect on that quote and proposal, and we can talk about it again if need be. And once you're feeling okay with that, then we sign a service agreement, and that's when the service starts.
And then we've got a really great question from Marie about whether it was possible to apply for funding, for example, if you wanted to engage in OT or for functional assessment, to get these things first.
Yes. Yes, that's a great, exactly. So tracking back, you might not have an NDIS plan that has the resources in it to be able to start doing these things. So that's the first thing to do, would be to figure out, to think about triggering the right NDIS process to get that funding in capacity building, for example, or support coordination. Sometimes it'd be great to have a support coordinator and they don't have one.
Fabulous. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Libby. I think it was very informational, and with all the links, I think people are feeling a lot more confident now. We will share a copy of the recording tomorrow alongside all the links. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.